welcome back to the Thought Balloons podcast. I am your host, Jeff Folsham. With me today is a good friend of mine, a role player, a world builder, a storyteller, Jonny C. Download. John, welcome to the podcast.
Hey everybody, how's it going? It's your boy Jonny Download here on Thought Bubbles, welcoming Jeff Folsham to the podcast. Jeff, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you.
It's good to be here.
Yeah. I'm just happy that our podcast has come so far. What are we in the double digits now?
This is number 11. Number
11, the double digits. Well,
big one.
It's great to be here in more ways than one.
Hell yeah. So we have played a lot of D&D together, a lot of RPGs. I think you as a dungeon master come up with some very unique settings, namely the Radass campaign For My Boys, in which our characters were absorbed into a storybook currently being written, where we could hear a narrator. When Nick and I talked about this, for our listeners, if you haven't listened to the second half of Nick Staples' episode, we touch briefly on a certain rad campaign. This Jonny here, John was the DM for that game. I want to know, where did you come up with the idea for having characters enter a storybook and be able to hear the author narrating and writing the story as we progressed through the adventure?
Yeah, if you haven't already, make sure you go back and listen to that episode. Definitely provides a lot of context for D&D and some of the stuff we'll be talking about. But in terms of the infamous More Ways Than One Radass campaign For My Boys, henceforth Radass, it came from a few different factors, a few different ideas that kicking around in the brain. I had ran a game in high school, and it was pretty heavily scripted for one session or two, classic introduction, sort of a bit more on rails, and that sort of carried over into what I thought would be good for a D&D game in Radass. And at the time, I had been listening to a podcast, much like this one, where two people talked about stories they had written. They did writing exercises.
Cool.
Every week, I believe, or so, where they would write just insane fantasy prompts about just wild topics, right? Usually viewer led, and they would pick something and something, right? Like great swords and wizards, right? And they had to write a story about great swords and wizards. It could be more abstract. Cool. But it was just so ridiculous at times, some of the stuff they came up with, because all they were really trying to do is make each other laugh, right? And make the viewer laugh. Ultimately, is really just at each other. And I really was listening to that, enjoying that, and I loved writing in my youth, and the idea of being in a story, right? Like classic films as a kid, never-ending story, Page Master, right?
Gotcha.
These sort of films shaped my youth, and I thought, what could it be fun to run a game like that? Have just this zany like crazy world where, the rules are so weird, and it's like, well, I could do it. I'm the dungeon master. I think that's where that sort of spark started, when I started to kind of formulate ideas for Radass.
I really like that. It was one of these things where when I was getting into the game, it was something that really, really like inspired me, because when I created the Osrin world, I like talked to people in like geosci majors and like professors at my school, just like,
Yeah.
hey, like if the mountains were here and we had similar like Coriolis effects to Earth, like what would the ecosystems be like? Because I wanted the world to feel like very like realistic. I have this kind of philosophy that the more close to Earth and the real world you can get in a fantasy setting, the easier it is for people to accept the fantastical elements. Whereas I feel like for you as a world builder and storyteller, you kind of just throw all that out the window. I could be
Yeah,
wrong,
I seem to be
but
the antithesis of it, right? At least with
yeah.
Radass.
Yeah,
I've
especially in Radass. Like that
yeah.
world is so wild and it's so fun. Because at least for me, it was one of these things where like I was able to really like let go of that almost obsession with like realism to a point.
No, yeah, I totally get it. I think in hindsight, what helped is also that it was layered, right? You're playing a
True.
character in a game, right? In a world to start out with, right? And then, as Jeff explained earlier, the start of the game, through whatever means, they encountered a mysterious sort of storybook, and it sucked them into the world of the book, right? And that's countless, movies have done that sort of song and dance before, but I think that you're like kind of twice removed as a player, right? There's like
Right.
that buffer of you and your character and their world they come from originally, and then in you and your character and this new world that they're in now. And so it's easy to kind of justify, it's like, oh, that's just like the story, right? That's like things are being made, and it made for an interesting sort of plot point as well.
True.
In hindsight, right? Is like, well, is this real, right? Is this like a pocket dimension? Is this their own world? Are these characters real? And you started
That is
feeling,
true.
for these characters, and
Yeah.
and
Poor little stink line and fly man.
yeah,
Oh god.
classic NPCs where you could just make whatever, that was the nice part about just kind of letting the reins go, right? Just letting
Yeah.
letting go of the wheel and just kind of seeing where it zags. Ended up being a lot of fun.
It is. Like I took a little inspiration from the Radass campaign in a game that I at the time of this recording have currently run. We did this on the I believe it was on my channel. It was the first episode of the Approved Adventures of Allhaven, which is a fantasy western RPG I'm doing with my stream team. I had them do a train fight, which was 100% influenced by the bone train in Radass when I got to fulfill one of my long time like it is still to this day, like what, 3-4 years later,
Mm-hmm.
it is still to this day my favorite encounter I have ever been a player in. To be able to fight on top of a moving train and just tripping dudes and having them fly off, and then being able to like swing in through a window of a train, even though I critically failed the attack. Like just being able to swing through a window on a moving
Yeah, the
train,
the
like
spectacle of it is so
the whole
memorable,
thing was
that the
so
cinematic.
amazing.
I
It
think
was
we maybe
so
talk more
fun.
into that later, maybe about encounters and stuff, about that, like setting up like I like to like set up big like set pieces, like big moments,
Yeah,
in my game, whether that's in the story or in the encounters or that sort of thing.
like
I
a
think they can
giant
lend
casino
themselves really well.
funhouse. But yeah, like I use that as inspiration, and in a game as of this recording that we have not yet um done, but I'm gonna take a little inspiration. I hope you don't mind. I'm taking a little inspiration of the Chrono Sphinx for an
Oh yeah.
upcoming thing, because I thought it would be really fun. I don't know if this episode will be out before or around then. So I'm not going to go too much more into detail here, because in case players of a certain Ozrin Tales Twitch stream listen to this, I don't want to give too much away. But yeah, like there have been many characters and encounters and just world elements that you have designed that are just really, really unique in, like, from my perspective. And yeah, man, like super fun to interact with in the world that you build.
Well, thank you. I think that's one of the crux things that I've enjoyed as a dungeon master is like making fun things for players to play with, right? And it's like, here's the blocks, I built them this way. Like, let's see you smash them, right? Or whatever you end up doing with them. That's kind of the fun of it is seeing how things shake out, in certain scenarios.
So we talked a little bit about so far about just you as a storyteller now. How did you get into storytelling? Like, what was the impetus to that in earlier in life?
I would say like as far back as as a kid, I loved reading, voracious reader, right? Read all the time. I was super big into that. And then eventually, of course, that pivots into writing. All right, you want to write your own stories.
Right.
And I think, I can see looking back how it formulated this sort of journey to get to a campaign like Radass of, writing these stories and having inspiration from all these different sources as a kid, right? Movies I loved or books that I loved. And I was like, I want to write a story like that. So I would just write that story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, I wanted to be a writer when I was in middle school and into high school. I took like classes and courses, right? I wrote all the time. I had journals. In middle school, I specifically wanted to be, you'll love this, a comic book artist.
Hell yeah.
But I quickly seeded that I can't draw and write this thing because I can do maybe one of these things. And so I had a friend in middle school and he would draw it and I would write it. And so, we wrote stories and we were like, I had a weekly sort of, not weekly in quotations, right? Loose schedule as a middle schooler trying to meet
Right.
deadlines
Right.
of writing stories and like a sort of storyboarding, like 4-strip or 4-panel like comic strips, right? And I'd want to like circulate them around the school. I had this big vision that I'd start circulating and people would want to pay me for them. And we'd make so much money. And I roped this other kid into drawing for me.
Oh man, that's cute. I like that.
Yeah. And then I just
like
kind of, I moved away from comics, over time. I still love and respect comics. They're such a great medium for storytelling, as I'm sure you're a little bit aware.
a little.
A little, you dabble casually.
Yeah, dabble here and there.
Into high school, I was like, oh, well, enough of the comics, enough of the child things. I'm going to be an auteur. I'm going to be an author. I'm going to take creative writing courses and high-level English, and I'm going to learn good word and write many page.
Yep.
And man, was I not great at that. It just became like difficult to have, I think, in high school especially, like a lot of confidence in my own narratives. Like, I was writing for the sake of wanting to make a career out of it, right? Wanting to like be good enough, write something good enough to publish.
Yeah.
Right. And that kind of became my focus in high school. And I ended up, no surprise, abandoning that pursuit by the time I graduated. that kind of ties into, D&D in a sense. I only DM'd really like one session in high school for this campaign that I had written, and it was heavily like scripted, very much like on rails storyline.
Right.
Especially as a new DM, right? That's fine. But I had
I think
like,
a lot of new DMs are rather on rails. Yeah.
oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's no problem with on rails storytelling, or writing, especially for newer DMs. I would recommend it, really. But I think especially back then, I didn't leave a lot of room for the players
Right.
to get in there. It was only one session, to be fair, but that's how that started. And then eventually with Radass, I kind of radically didn't mean to say that twice. Drastically shifted. We'll fix it in post. Edit right here.
Yeah.
Drastically fixed what I thought was wrong, and ended up kind of turning what was once I kind of thought as a negative into a positive.
I couldn't agree more. Like, I mean, I'm sure there will be nothing but praise throughout their whole podcast here, but yeah, super fun campaign. Like,
Thank you.
there are games that I very much enjoy, and like my enjoyment of those games are at an equal level of Radass, but they're more for like, oh, we took this campaign like really seriously, and like everybody was playing their characters like really well, and like, this, that, and the other, right? And like we all had like good tactics and stuff. And I think we all had that in Radass, but there's like that other layer of just like the world is so weird and zany that we could just kind of let loose and have a lot of fun, just like pure, just without any other pretense, right? Because like things like there's a wizarding rap battle, right? Like just
Yeah.
things like that where you're just like, okay, yeah, we're not taking this like too seriously. And so where, my enjoyment of other campaigns is like, oh yeah, I did a really good job of playing the dwarfiest dwarf who ever did dwarf, right? And
Yeah.
have like
Watch episode
this,
5 if you haven't.
yeah,
Better.
um,
Required listening.
where like I did this whole story arc of like he hated everybody but dwarves to finally ending the campaign of like he's cool with everybody because he had to like live his life with a drow and a wood elf.
Yeah,
um
absolutely. And I think that's like the beauty of storytelling, right? Like
it's so
just
just
the
diverse.
yeah, the palette of stories, the everyone has different visions and different styles. And, even, within what you're doing right now, you've run different versions of Osrin and different
Hmm.
timelines and different settings. And they all can feel different, but they all have that Jeff flavor. You know what I mean?
It is hard to divorce oneself from oneself. Like everything we do is going to have that sort of essence of us. Like even when I'm playing characters who I would say are nothing like me, people in the games, um with me as players, or even the DM who know me as a person, will be like, dude, you clearly are self-inserting here with like this and this. And I'm like, wait, no. Yeah, it's like it's very hard to completely remove yourself from the things that you're creating. So but that's, again, that's one of the fun things about playing D&D. And I feel very lucky. I know there is a lot of people out there who constantly, like I see on like, various forums on the internet and places, or people I've talked to through Twitch and various like Discord communities, who constantly say like, oh, if I could only find a you know whereas our group that we played with, UDM, IDM, Steve DMs, Nick DMs, Tyler's run a few games, Alex has run a few like there's so many, like most of us have DM'd, and it's Like, it's something that I feel very, very lucky and privileged to be able to experience so many different people's like styles of role playing and game mastering.
Yeah, I think we've been really fortunate to have so many people that enjoy or have that drive to want to tell stories. And to those listening that haven't, I would recommend at least trying it once, one session at the very least, trying to
Yep.
DM or even just story tell. It can be on rails, but I think it's something everybody should at least try and experience in some capacity. I know writing isn't everyone's bag. It can be very intimidating, especially D&D sometimes with the mechanics and having to worry about hit points and to hit and all these numbers. And I really would just recommend just strip all that back and just try and tell a fun story, something you think that you'll enjoy and your friends will enjoy, and just have fun with it. Don't take it too seriously.
Yeah, definitely don't take it too seriously, especially in the beginning.
Yeah.
I'll add to this a little bit. I was actually saying to someone last night that I was talking to, or maybe it was the night before, whatever. The idea of I don't know how to DM, I'm too worried, like it seems like it's a real heavy, get all of that out of your head. I think I mentioned on a previous podcast, it may have been with Nick, it may have been my solo episode. I started DMing before I had ever even played a tabletop RPG. My only experience with RPGs had been like a couple of the Fallout. I think Fallout 3. I don't even think Fallout New Vegas had come out yet. And like a few things like that where there was like a couple dialogue options, right? Like that was my only experience with any of this stuff. I just read a few blog posts about how Gygax did his thing, and I listened to like the one or two podcasts that Acquisitions Incorporate had out yet. They hadn't even started filming their PAX thing games yet. So I'm here to tell you, if I can do it with like almost no background in it, if you have played even a single game or have watched a single episode of some of people playing the game, you can go out there, you can DM. It's very low barrier for entry, because in essence, all you're doing as the DM, you're just playing another character like anybody else. Now, your character might be the weather 1 minute, and then next minute it might be a townsperson or a shopkeeper or a monster. But really, just like the players listen to what you have to say and react to what you're doing, once you get over that first interaction, you as a DM are just reacting to what the players have to do. And it's just this back and forth kind of, you get some input, you respond to it. The other side gets that input, and they respond to it. 4 hours later, you've had a really good time. And even if the story doesn't make sense, at least you've spent quality time with friends.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great exercise in maybe getting a peek behind the screen themselves, right? And seeing some of the minutia DMs do when it comes to planning, when it comes to building everything from the story to the world to the characters and the plot points. I think it's a good thing. That's really it, plain and simple.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
And you should at least try it. Yeah, do it. Well, go ahead and pause the podcast, and when you've finished, you can come back and continue listening.
Exactly. You know what? And I think this is a good time for us. I know time is short for us here tonight on this particular episode. I think we'll take, as you take a break from this podcast to go play a game, we'll take a break to listen to an ad or two. We will be right back with Jonny Download here on Thought Balloons Podcast. Do you want to class up your gaming? Are you sick of card tables and cheap plastic sleeves for your character sheets? Do you like real wood and are convinced magnets are the only magic we have left in our current age of science? Then head over to legendcraft.ca to spruce up your tabletop gaming setup. They offer felt top gaming tables with add-ons like cup holders, tablet holders, dice trays, roll boxes, and more. Newly released in January 2021 is their Magna Tracker system. With versions for both health and spell tracking, these sleek and stylish tracking boards come with magnetized tracking pips that allow you to slide them back and forth along clean-cut channels, making tracking your health and spell slots easy to use and read, all without the constant erasing and writing on your character sheet. And did I mention that both the Magna Trackers and the tables are customizable and personalizable? That's right. Your table and or Magna Tracker will be one of a kind when you order at Legendcraft. Legendcraft is partnering with me to offer you a 5% discount on your orders at legendcraft.ca. That's right, you can get a 5% discount when you enter the code F_ART at checkout. That's F_art. Go to legendcraft.ca. That's LEGENDCRAFT.ca with discount code F_art for 5% off. Legendcraft.ca. Order today. If you like this podcast and would like to support the show, head over to patreon.com/Folsham_art. As little as $1 per month, you not only support Thought Balloons and get to submit questions to be answered by myself and the guest host, but you will also have access to my webcomic 3 to 4 weeks before they're released to the public and my weekly update blog. At higher tiers, you'll gain access to full issues and short story comics, and you can even see progress and add input to projects I'm working on. That's patreon.com/FOULSHAM_ART to support Thought Balloons today. Welcome back to the Thought Balloons podcast with Jonny Download. Jonny, how was your break?
It was good, but I'm more curious about the viewer. How did that first time running that session go?
Yes.
What do you? Sorry, did you just skip the adverts? You wouldn't have done that. Go back and I don't care if you've already. Go back and listen to them again, and then come back.
Yes, tell us all about the Anchor podcasting platform and the Legendcraft and all of my Patreon rewards that you can find at patreon.com/Folsham_art.
You thought you could escape the ads.
Yeah,
but you can't.
But you can't, because here they are. And you can give that feedback to us through our Patreon exclusive Discord channels. Fun times. But before the break, we had mentioned a few times about on the rails storytelling. I'd like to expand on that a little bit. I know for my perspective, I feel like there's this big kind of push in the role-playing community about, like, you know, on rails is so bad, like you got to give your players like permission to make decisions on their own, and you know, if there's a T in the road and you want them to go right, and there's, you know, something to the left, you know, there is like the edge of the map is to the left, like, well, that's, you know, punishing players for wanting to go left, right? I have two ideas on it, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it. But very quickly, like, unless there's a very specific reason why what you want them to see has to be on the right, you know, you can just move it to the left. Like, if you've prepared a specific encounter for one night, there's no potentially detrimental thing of just sliding it to a different location, right? The other thing is, and I think maybe more important than that, is if you're going to be playing a story-driven game, just let your players know beforehand. Like, tell them, like, hey, I've got a pretty, you know, in-depth kind of story here about characters that are going to go on this epic quest. They're going to walk to this volcano, and you're going to have to throw a ring in there, and there's going to be wizards and orcs and all these other things. If you really have a passion to tell a specific story, just let your players know, and most players are going to be on board to help with that. John, what are your thoughts about on rails storytelling?
Absolutely agree. I think some DMs get very attached to certain things in certain places at certain times, especially if you spend time preparing them. And their example, like you said, they zig when you want them to zag, they go left, and you want them to go right. And it can get some DMs can get in that mindset where like, well, they didn't go right, so they don't want to do that, and all the things I prepared on the right are gone. And there's a lot of DM tricks you'll learn as you continue to build out your story, build out your world. But honestly, the one of the biggest things I can recommend is just save everything. Like you'll use it eventually in some way. It could be wearing a different skin, it can be in a totally different place, but you'll circle back to using it. If it's a really good idea and you were really excited to do it, you'll definitely use it sometime. And yeah, the other thing is communication. Talk to each other. I am so fortunate to be playing with a group of very close friends in our current home game. And man, we are so in sync because of our communication that it's led to some great stories and some great moments. And we're continuing to character arcs going forward, and I'm so excited to see where that'll go. So a lot of all good relationships, they're based on communication.
Exactly. Even if you're playing with people who aren't like close personal friends, one of the biggest ways to build a rapport with new players is just be open and honest about a lot of this stuff. Free flowing communication is important in all groups, and I think it's an understated, almost. I think a lot of like veteran players almost take it as a given, but like a lot of new players can be intimidated by the whole scene. And I think it's important to say, like, talk to each other, like lay it down some ground rules. It was many years before I'd ever heard of like a session 0,
That's a
and
classic.
yeah, it's something that I find to be very, very important now that I know about it. Anybody listening, go, Google search. You can find stuff about session 0 out there. Basic principle is getting all this stuff out in the open. Google the same page tool. That's like a nice guide to how to run a pretty solid session 0, to get everybody on the same page before you play. But it's basically just a session where you lay down sort of like the ground rules for a campaign. Not only do you talk like actual rules, like if we're gonna alter this rule a little bit here or there, you get to make characters together, not just mechanically, but you get to build the group together. And you also get to talk about, like, is this going to be a game where you start in a specific town and then whatever the players want to do is what you can do, or is there going to be a main quest line, and is it going to be more story, is it going to be more open? It's just something like I said, I didn't know about it for a couple years, and it's something that has, I think, increased the overall quality of my playing with all groups, whether they're new or old friends. Just having a common understanding of what the expectations are is super important and almost liberating in a way, because the framework in which you're going to be playing.
Absolutely. I think, like you said, establishing those expectations early, getting everybody together. I've had games that are much longer stories. My current game that I'm running for my friends here locally, to shorter stories, shorter arcs. I've kind of established. I even had the quantity of sessions approximately for a shorter, kind of darker, moodier, grittier setting And all those details lend to player and DM expectations.
Right.
So when the characters, or the players rather, know the setting, they can form that in the characters and the choices they make and their backstory and their disposition and all of that. Just all these are important, minor little elements that you as collaborative storytelling group, because that's what D&D is. You're collaboratively telling a story. Can help shape the arcs that you're going to tell, and when it all comes together, it's just so damn good.
It really is. It really is. Yeah, like you said, not only like the length of campaign can like inform that stuff, right? So when the sessions are only going to be like 8 or 10 episodes, that's when if you're like me, that's when you'll write a 12-page backstory.
Classic.
And when it's a full campaign that lasts 2 years, that's when you'll just say, I'm playing the dwarfiest dwarf who ever did dwarf. And
Hey, but if
most
it works,
people
it
would do
works.
the opposite, but I'm weird like that. I gotta ask. So for our listeners, John did run a game. You said darker, grittier. We're all a bunch of monster hunters. I may have mentioned this in next game. I don't, or his podcast. I don't remember.
Yes, you guys
But
did discuss.
I know we talked the backstory, but I gotta ask you: did you read that 12-page story with pictures? I will say there was 2 pictures on each page, but did you actually read that whole thing, or did you just look at the TLDR that I put at the bottom?
No, I read the whole thing for sure. It informs certain elements of the story in a way, and sort of like the world. I know the world wasn't the focus in that particular game, but
Right.
like having like that background and that backbone that, I mean, you helped establish in that sense, gave it a lot more like a concrete sort of feeling that there was other stuff beyond sort of central sort of city that you guys mostly played in.
So now that we've brought up, we'll say the Scourge of Beasts, this this other darker, grittier, like low fantasy, right? Like there wasn't
Yeah.
like magic was like even like hard to come by and almost feared,
Yeah.
in a way. Versus Radass, which is ultra high fantasy, where just
Yes.
like magic is pouring out of people's butts, sometimes literally. um do you have a preference to one genre over the other?
I think as a DM who's run, a few of these games now, I think it just comes down to the time and the place, right? Like, and who's going to be there and what I can do and what I'm feeling. I'm usually, I recommend this to everybody, DM or not. The world ends with you, right? You're only as strong as everything that you've absorbed, right? Whether that's whatever sort of media that is, that's books, that's music, podcasts, subscribe to Thought Balloons on Spotify, whether that's movies or TV shows, right? You're limited by those constraints about what you know, because I hate to break it, you don't know everything. You can't think of all the sick shit. And people have been thinking of sick shit for hundreds of years.
Exactly.
And there's like fucking like at least 1 million people. 2 on a good day.
Yeah.
And they're all
There's
making
at least
stuff.
1 million people.
Like, why would you not? That's like the biggest resource you could possibly use. And I think people shy away from it because they're afraid of like plagiarism. I'm not saying, 1-to-1 Lord of the Rings here, right? But
Right.
if that's what you want to run and that's like what you feel comfortable with, and you find people that are like, oh, this could be fun, like let's do something like that, like Middle Earth as a setting, or something equivalent, right? Middle Dirt, like it it doesn't matter. But you gotta look at stuff. You gotta take in stuff, because you take it in and you fucking grind it all up together, and whatever comes out, that's storytelling. And I
Now
think
that's what I call storytelling.
that's right. That's right. Whatever mushy, gushy, messy stuff comes out, that's storytelling. And I think, with this smaller, grittier, low fantasy setting with, Scourge, I was, into that sort of media at the time, right?
Mhm.
Informs that, right? And, obviously you write what you read and vice versa, though. Not always the recommendation. Sometimes, you go the opposite. But, it helped inform that sort of darker, grittier sort of setting. And then, of course, on the flip side, kind of contrary or rather lending itself to what I just said, with Radass, I had been listening to that podcast, and I was like, man, like this is so much fun. Like I'd love to have like a world like this, like where players can just like just do whatever, right? It felt so
Yeah.
freeing to just kind of let go of the wheel and just like let's see what fucking happens, like. And part of that was like to get away from the stuffiness of fantasy sometimes,
Mhm.
right? It can be so fucking circle jerky
Right.
sometimes, right? You're just fucking stroking. It's so masturbatory sometimes in fantasy, right? These ridiculous swords and people and places. And to kind of just turn that on its head and hold this mirror up to it and say, here's you, dude. This is what you look like with all your shit, like, and then to shatter that mirror with a dude who has a hammer for a hand, right? Like, like it's
Yep.
just, you can just crank it up and that's fun, right? In the face of whatever. And I'll touch on one more thing because I think following those sort of games in my current game, to kind of round out this point, is kind of a mid and it's approaching a high magic in my current game, right? We're kind of like straddling that line where magic's becoming more commonplace. It's roughly inspired by Eberron, in terms
Okay.
of that universe and that lore. And certain things are just starting to come into being. And there are more places that are obviously higher magic than others, as is the nature of a world. And I do really like that balance for now. But part of me recently thought of very, for lack of better verbology, a very rat ass encounter. All right. I was like, oh man, this would be so much fun to like kind of have in this game. It's like, well, how would it fit? I wrestled with that for a while, of thinking of certain things, and I've kind of parsed it, and I feel comfortable kind of inserting that sort of zaniness into like one sort of a scene. And kind of like what you said earlier, you can never really fully divorce from yourself. Those
Right.
elements are always kind of be there. Um, so I really just think it comes down to when and where. I think inevitably you'll have like grittier situations, right? From whatever influences or really zany ones or some sort of middle ground. But I think you're only as knowledgeable as what's coming in, right? And what's coming out of you, right?
Right. Right. So we've talked about high fantasy, low fantasy. Have you thought about diverging from fantasy in general to like run other genres? I know that's something that in the last year or so that's become more and more of a interest for me. With I do the Osrin Tales comics and
Mm-hmm.
fantasy adventure. I've been running the Osrin live D&D show now for about a year. And before then, I'd only basically been playing fifth edition since it was D&D Next, like it was in beta. And it's just many, many years of just pure, just fantasy saturation. Like when we decided to do like a season based uh show partway through season one, we're like, you know what, it'd be fun to have like a break, like a significant break, not just like a week here or a week there. um I was like, you know what, it'd be fun to like explore other genres. So I know that's something like I'm super interested in. Have you considered like going outside the fantasy genre at all while we're talking about settings and things like that?
It's funny you mention it because in the past couple of weeks I've kind of brought up a few friends about the possibility of running like a cyberpunk S type game. I've wanted to run something like that, like Shadowrun or something like that for some time, pre Cyberpunk 2077 nonsense. But having that extra media is certainly
Right.
inspiring in some ways to see some of the cool designs and the artwork, in lieu of the game being what it is. There's so much great cyberpunk media out there, and kind of like pull into one of my favorite sort of future dystopias, Ghost in the Shell, the hit animated movies and series, is so great. And there's so much there to explore that I would love to sink my teeth into. So definitely have interest in that. Um, whatever vehicle that ends up being in, whether it's D&D or Shadowrun or some other style of tabletop role-playing game. I'll get to that when I get to that as my sort of
Right.
philosophy. I'm more worried about the story itself, right? The characters, the world, the fun, I think, of
Hmm.
D&D is that story and getting setting up the playground, right? And then putting all the
Right.
tools and all the play pieces out there, and then seeing what clicks and what doesn't click. And I think the benefit of having run these sort of different styles of games, whether long form over years or short over like 8 to 10 sessions, is I feel comfortable, maybe adapting it to parsing it down to a smaller, sort of arc, because I've done that before versus longer sort of slower sort of burns of stories. But there's so much out there like to tell. I know you've been working on Western stuff.
Hmm.
That's been really cool to see. There's so much fun stuff you can do with that sort of setting.
Well, that was actually, I think, the beginning of uh my want to like branch out into different um genres. Like I a few months back, I go through phases every couple of months. I like to dust off the old Fallout series of games. It's my favorite game series. I think ever. So I go back to, maybe not this. It's not always Fallout 3. It's not always New Vegas or 4, whatever. Um, but I'll definitely pick up one of those games, throughout the entire franchise, probably 2, 3 times a year. And last year I was playing one of the games, and one of the things that I really like that Bethesda added to the game when they took it over for Fallout 3 is the music. And I'll get on these kicks where like I just want to listen to like that kind of music, even if I'm not playing the game, and the want to listen to the old crooners and like the old, country, like Western music, like pre like 60s stuff, right?
Right.
Like Marty Robbins. And like that was where I was listening to a Marty Robbins song. Um, he was the guy who did Big Iron, that was featured in New Vegas. Um,
Classic.
yeah, it's a classic song. Anybody who's played that game probably loves that song. But he did another song. Just listen to his stuff on Spotify. This is listen to another song of his called Mr. Shorty, which is about this guy who he is like 5'3" or something, and he gets like this rough and tumble dude in the bar makes fun of him, and they have like a little shootout and stuff. And I was like, this imagery in this song is just so intense, like so vivid. I was like, I could turn this into a comic, and I did, and it's available through my Patreon if you're interested in reading a 6-page Western story, fantasy Western. I made Mr. Shorty a halfling. The guy who bullies him is a tiefling. The bartender in the story is like a robot guy. But I had so much fun doing that fantasy Western comic that like I started thinking about, well, like, why not just start genre mashing other things. And so like last October I did a fantasy noir story, which is like set in the 40s. I really like fantasy, like dwarves, elves, all that kind of stuff, because that stuff's fun to draw, and
Yeah.
magic is fun to play around with. but
Of
I find
course.
it's really fun to mess with the genre. Um, which brings me to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, you had talked about it depends on the story. I think you and I are we diverge in that regard too, because I will be like, "Ooh, this setting would be fun," or "This genre would be really fun," and then I work to create a story for that genre. I you and maybe you agree with that or don't, but I feel like you hinted at it's the opposite way. It's more story first for you, and then based on the story, you develop a setting or a genre.
I think it goes both ways, certainly. Definitely there are times where I'm like, oh man, this would be like a fun story to tell. Right, and that kind of fits within the line of D&D in general. Just because I'm so familiar with that universe, and when I'm thinking of
Right.
DMing, I'm like, oh man. And there are times where I think of a really cool like setting, and it's like, oh man, this would be like fun to play in. Like, okay, what would that story look like? Similar to the gritty Scourge of Beast settings that we've been talking about.
Mhm.
Um,
I was actually going to say, I feel like that one may have been a setting first idea.
yes. I think a lot of the shorter campaigns I've run or wish to run, kind of like that like cyberpunk, like dystopian, like one that I want to run is more about the setting first, where I don't have
Okay.
like a big story that I want to tell, but I want to
Right.
like play in that world. So the setting is first
Okay.
and like foremost on that.
That makes
And the
sense.
story is secondary. Um, so yeah, I think it varies. I mean, that's the beauty of telling stories, and when you get a few under your belt, being able to kind of weave and um, vary things depending on what inspires you. Really, that's what it comes down to. I've got here a Patreon question from our Patreon here. This one says, "Dear Mr. Fulsham and Mr. Download, what is the sexiest dice?" They've chosen to remain anonymous, but Jeff, what is the sexiest dice?
Um, for me, and this is a weird one, but I've always been a fan of circles, like when it comes to art. A lot of my abstract art, or non-figurative art, plays with circles as shapes and things like that.
Uh-huh.
So the rounder the die, the sexier it is for me. So you've seen those D100s that are all just one die. It is basically just a
One big
sphere.
ball. Yeah.
It's just like a sphere. I like that. I like the D30, which is also like a very round die.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
Now, is
like
that
those.
because they're, atom? Oh God. Uh, anatomical. I got so excited there to say that. Anatomical equivalent, if you will. Quivering.
um, did you just
Equivalent?
say quivering?
Hmm? You can't dodge the question, Mr. Fulsham, please. Just is it because it looks like boobs and butts? Is it?
I mean, maybe that could be a subconscious thing. I don't know. I
That's
just
a
like it's when like I have it's like, I don't know, man. See, this is you're asking me these questions. I'm supposed to put the guest on the spot. That's how this is supposed to work, not the other way around. No, for me, like I have an interest in like astrophysics. I like the what the heck is going on here? Hold on a sec. I'm gonna cut that
sorry,
out.
folks. We're having technical difficulty. He's thinking about dice. He's getting all horned up on the
No,
podcast.
I
This is
had
all staying in,
I, I had an
unedited.
app
We're getting
opened.
raw.
I had an app opened and people started talking. I thought you started playing a sound effect. I was like, the fuck is going on here?
Just started fucking. I could bust out the
Literally,
soundboard.
I had, for whatever reason, I had my Twitch still open on a channel that was not live, and then they went live, and the
No.
fucking ad started playing. No, okay, so circles, I think they are a perfect form, like a perfect shape. Um I have an interest in astrophysics and or just not astrophysics, but like astronomy. I like space stuff. I'm not very well educated in it, but I like listening to hear people talk about it. And the idea that like a strong enough source of gravity is going to compress something into a sphere, I think may influence it a little bit. But yeah, just the idea that every point of the line of a circle is equidistant from the middle is a comforting thought for me. Yeah, just I like circles. There's just something about
Interesting.
the circle that I like. Um which in recent years has become my favorite shape.
Interesting. It's always interesting to see
So
what people's responses are to that question.
you, Mr. Download? What do you think is the sexiest dice?
There's a lot of controversy surrounding my choice. I've gotten a lot of shit for it over the years from a lot of different communities. I've had to burn some bridges because of it.
I have
But
an idea. I don't know the answer to this, but I have a guess.
now it's controversial because as a dice, it's probably my least favorite.
Interesting.
But from pure form, it has to be a D4.
Interesting. I was gonna guess a D12.
D12, actually, I'm looking here at the Patreon viewers supporters poll here at patreon.com/Folsham_art. And that is the most popular player's choice, it would seem, is the D12. Do you think that has roots to just being the highest damage dice, the highest hit dice? Outside
I
of
think probably highest damage, highest hit die, but also it is very underutilized die in general, and I think people are
they
attracted to an
covet what they
underdog.
never use.
Yeah, they're attracted to an underdog.
Yeah, D4s look like nipples. So, all right, next question.
It's an odd shaped nipple, but sure.
Hmm?
I said it's an oddly shaped nipple, but sure.
I mean, you do you.
Yeah. But I'm looking through here. I don't see any other questions for this week. John, is there any parting thoughts that you would like to leave with the audience? I know we are short on interview time. We have things to do here, so it's a little bit shorter, but we're coming up on an hour. Any parting thoughts, any parting words of encouragement or anything like that for our folks listening today?
I have a couple things I'd like to say. One person in particular isn't going to want to hear it, but we'll save that for last. First things first, tell a damn story. Just do it. Come on. Just try it. Come on. Just try it. It's not as bad as you think. Just like a beginning, middle, end, or even just 2 points. That's fine. Conflict resolution. And let your players or your friends or whoever it may be help you fill in that sort of that help them, they help you, you both build a bridge to where you're trying to go. That's the best way to look at it, my opinion.
Agreed.
Secondly, you can support patreon.com/Folsham_art for as little as $1 and get some sick shit. You can join in some of these exciting polls about sexiest dice. We're going to get into some other controversial topics.
And you can submit questions in our Patreon exclusive Discord channel.
That's right. I'm going to be looking for all your questions. That way we can answer them. And there's only one thing left to say, and that's Fred Durst. I know you're listening. You can surf a piece of plywood straight up my ass. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thanks for being on the show.